Mia held the basketball in her hands, but her mind was racing faster than her heart. She looked at Caitlin, who was standing a few feet away with a small smile on her face. That smile told her everything she needed to know. "You did that on purpose," Mia said quietly, so only Caitlin could hear her over the excited crowd. Caitlin's smile grew wider, but she didn't say anything. She just shrugged slightly as if to say, "Prove it." The arena was buzzing with anticipation. Everyone expected Mia to take her 20th shot and claim victory over one of college basketball's biggest stars. The fans were counting down, cameras were rolling, and this moment was about to become part of basketball history. But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had watched Caitlin Clark play for 3 years. She had studied every free throw, every routine, every tiny detail of her form. That miss wasn't natural, it was too perfect in its imperfection. "Why?" Mia asked, still holding the ball. "Why what?" Caitlin replied, but her eyes gave away the truth. "Why did you miss that shot? Your form was exactly the same as the previous 18. Your routine was identical. That wasn't a miss. That was a choice." The crowd was starting to get restless. They wanted to see Mia take her shot and complete this incredible upset. But Mia wasn't moving toward the free throw line. Caitlin walked closer to her, lowering her voice so only Mia could hear. "You want to know why? Because I realized something during this contest." "What?" "You didn't challenge me to prove you could beat me. You challenged me to prove you belonged on the same court as me. And you've already done that. 19 in a row against someone who shoots free throws for a living? You've proven everything you needed to prove." Mia felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but she fought them back. "That's not fair to you. You earned every one of those shots." "And so did you," Caitlin replied firmly. "But this isn't about winning or losing anymore. This is about something bigger." "What do you mean?" Caitlin gestured toward the crowd, toward the cameras, toward the thousands of people who would see this moment. "Look around, Mia. How many young girls with disabilities are watching this right now? How many kids who think they can't compete are seeing you go shot for shot with me?" Mia looked up at the stands where her family was watching with tears in their eyes. She saw other fans recording on their phones, sharing this moment with people all over the world. She thought about all the kids like her who would see this video, who would realize that their dreams weren't impossible. "You could have just let me win outright," Mia said. "No, I couldn't," Caitlin shook her head. "Because that would have been charity. This way everyone knows you earned it. You made 19 straight free throws under pressure in front of a crowd against someone who does this professionally. Nobody can ever take that away from you." The crowd was getting louder, chanting, "Shoot, shoot, shoot." But Mia was having the most important conversation of her life. "What if I miss this shot?" she asked. "Then you miss," Caitlin said simply. "But you'll have missed after making 19 in a row. That's not failure. That's excellence." Mia looked down at the basketball in her hands. It felt heavier now, not because of its weight but because of what it represented. This wasn't just about a free throw contest anymore. This was about showing the world that ability comes in all forms. "Can I tell you something?" Mia said. "Of course. I've dreamed about this moment for 2 years. Not winning, but just being here. Just being seen as a real basketball player instead of an inspiration story." Caitlin's expression softened. "What changed your mind?" "You did," Mia replied. "The way you talked to me tonight. The way you treated me like a competitor instead of a charity case. You made me realize that I don't need to win to prove I belong here. I just need to be here." "So what are you going to do?" Mia smiled, and for the first time all night she felt completely calm. "I'm going to take my shot. Not because I want to beat you, but because I love basketball. And because every kid watching needs to see that you never stop shooting, no matter what." She rolled her wheelchair to the free throw line one last time. The crowd fell silent as she began her routine. 3 bounces of the ball. Roll her shoulders back. Find her grip. Focus on the back of the rim. But before she shot, she looked over at Caitlin one more time. "Thank you," she said. "Not for missing that shot, but for everything else." "Thank you," Caitlin replied. "You reminded me why I fell in love with this game in the first place." Mia took a deep breath and released the ball. It sailed through the air with perfect rotation, the same beautiful arc she had perfected through thousands of hours of practice. The ball swished through the net. The arena exploded in the loudest cheer of the entire night. Fans rushed down from the upper sections. Security guards were wiping tears from their eyes, and even the maintenance crew stopped working to applaud. But the most beautiful moment came next. Instead of celebrating her victory, Mia immediately rolled over to Caitlin and extended her hand. "Thank you for the best game of my life," she said. Caitlin took her hand and then pulled her into a hug that lasted nearly a minute. When they finally separated, both players had tears in their eyes. "I have something for you," Caitlin said, sitting down on the court to untie her game shoes. "These got me through 32 points tonight. I want you to have them." She handed Mia her shoes, which were still warm from the game. On the side of one shoe, she quickly wrote with a Sharpie that a fan had handed her, "To Mia, you didn't beat me, you inspired me. Keep shooting for your dreams." "I can't accept these," Mia said, overwhelmed. "You already did?" Caitlin smiled. "Besides, I have a feeling you're going to need good shoes for your college career." The crowd was still cheering as arena staff began setting up for interviews. Multiple news stations wanted to talk to both players, and social media was already exploding with videos of the contest. But for Mia, the most important moment came when she looked up at her family in the stands. Her mother was crying happy tears, her brother was jumping up and down, and her father, who had driven 6 hours from work to make it to the game, was standing and applauding harder than anyone else in the building. 6 months later, Mia received scholarship offers from 4 different universities with top wheelchair basketball programs. She chose Auburn, just like she had always dreamed. And on the day she signed her letter of intent, a familiar face was sitting in the front row of the press conference. Caitlin Clark, who had kept her promise to follow Mia's journey, was there, with a sign of her own. It read, "Mia Rodriguez, real champion. Some challenges are bigger than winning or losing. Some moments change not just games, but lives. And sometimes the most important victory is simply showing the world that you belong on the court." Mia had done all of that and more. The ESPN studio buzzed with its usual morning energy as coffee cups clinked and papers shuffled across desks. Camera crews adjusted their equipment while makeup artists put finishing touches on the day's hosts. In the middle of all this controlled chaos sat 2 men who had worked together for years yet lately felt like strangers. Stephen A. Smith leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone to catch up on overnight sports news. Across from him, his longtime colleague and fellow analyst fidgeted with his notes, his jaw tight with barely contained frustration. The tension between them had been building for weeks, and anyone paying close attention could feel it crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. It all started when Caitlin Clark entered the professional basketball scene. The young woman had taken the sports world by storm, breaking records and drawing crowds that hadn't been seen in women's basketball for years. Her games were selling out, her jersey sales were through the roof, and every sports network wanted a piece of the Caitlin Clark phenomenon. But not everyone was celebrating. The veteran analyst had been in the sports commentary business for over 15 years. He had covered countless games, interviewed hundreds of athletes, and built what he thought was a solid reputation. Yet here was this rookie player getting more attention in her first month than some seasoned players got in their entire careers. During commercial breaks, he would mutter under his breath about the unfairness of it all. "It's just hype," he would say to anyone who would listen. "Give it 6 months and everyone will move on to the next shiny thing." His comments started small, just little jabs here and there, but they were getting sharper with each passing day. Stephen A. noticed everything. He had been in this business long enough to read people like open books, and he could see the resentment growing in his colleagues' eyes every time Clark's name came up in their show rundown. At first, he tried to ignore it, hoping it would pass. Everyone gets frustrated sometimes, especially in such a competitive industry. The morning show prep meetings became increasingly uncomfortable when producers would suggest segments about Clark's impact on ticket sales or her influence on young fans. The veteran analyst would roll his eyes or make sarcastic comments. "Are we a sports show or a fan club?" he asked one morning, earning awkward glances from the production team. Stephen A. pulled him aside after that meeting. "Look, I get it," he said, keeping his voice low. "Sometimes the coverage feels overwhelming. But this is what's driving ratings right now. This is what people want to see." The analyst nodded, but Stephen A. could see the agreement was surface level only. Behind his eyes was something deeper, something that went beyond professional disagreement. It was personal, and that made it dangerous. The situation got worse during their live broadcasts. When discussing women's basketball, the analyst would find ways to downplay Clark's achievements. He would bring up statistics from decades past, trying to diminish what she was accomplishing. "She's good, but let's not act like she's reinventing." "The game" became his favorite phrase. Viewers started noticing. Social media comments began pointing out the obvious bias. "Why does he seem to hate on Clark so much?" people asked. "What's his problem with giving credit where it's due?" The questions were valid, and they were becoming harder to ignore. Stephen A. tried different approaches. Sometimes he would redirect the conversation, steering it toward more neutral ground. Other times he would actively counter his colleagues' negativity with positive points about Clark's impact. But it felt like trying to hold back a dam with his bare hands. The breaking point was approaching, and everyone in the studio could sense it. During one particularly tense pre-show meeting, the veteran analyst went too far. The producers had planned a segment celebrating Clark's rookie achievements, comparing them to other legendary first-year performances. Instead of professional analysis, he launched into what sounded more like a personal attack. "Everyone's acting like she's some kind of savior," he said, his voice rising. "What about all the players who've been grinding for years without getting a fraction of this attention? What about the real veterans who've actually earned their respect?" The room fell silent. Production assistants suddenly found their phones. "Very interesting." Even the usually chatty makeup artist stopped mid-conversation. Stephen A. felt his patience wearing thin. This wasn't about sports analysis anymore. This was about jealousy, plain and simple. His colleague wasn't criticizing Clark's game or her statistics. He was angry about her success, her popularity, her ability to draw crowds and generate buzz. "We need to talk," Stephen A. said after the meeting, but his colleague was already gathering his papers and heading for the door. "Nothing to talk about," came the reply. "I'm just doing my job, giving honest analysis instead of jumping on every bandwagon that rolls through." But Stephen A. knew better. He had seen this before in other analysts, other commentators who couldn't handle it when someone else became the center of attention. The industry was full of egos, and sometimes those egos got bruised when a new star emerged. The veteran analyst had built his career on being the expert, the one with insider knowledge and sharp takes. But Clark's rise had happened so fast and generated so much organic excitement that traditional analysis seemed almost beside the point. Fans didn't need experts to tell them why they should be excited about watching her play. They just were. And that, Stephen A. realized, was what really bothered his colleague. For the first time in years, maybe decades, the conversation was happening, without him. Clark's story was writing itself, and no amount of expert commentary could slow it down or redirect it. The morning of what would become their most explosive confrontation started like any other. Coffee brewing, papers rustling, cameras being positioned. But the tension in the air was thicker than usual. Stephen A. watched his colleague's face as they reviewed the day's talking points, seeing the familiar tightness around his eyes whenever Clark's name appeared on the rundown. Something was going to give, and Stephen A. could feel it building, like pressure in a sealed container. His colleague's resentment had been growing for weeks, fed by every highlight reel, every sold-out arena, every positive story about the rookie sensation. The veteran analyst sat across from him, shuffling through his notes one more time, preparing for what he didn't know would be his last normal broadcast. His frustration had reached a boiling point, and Stephen A. could see it written all over his face. In just a few hours, everything would change. The careful balance they had maintained, the professional courtesy that had kept their disagreements behind closed doors was about to shatter completely. Stephen A. took a deep breath and prepared for what was coming, knowing that sometimes in television, as in sports, you have to make the hard calls to protect the integrity of the game. The red recording light blinked on, and millions of viewers tuned in for what they expected to be another regular sports talk show. The studio lights cast their familiar warm glow as Stephen A. Smith looked directly into the camera with his signature, confidence. Next to him sat his longtime colleague, who had managed to paste on a professional smile despite the storm brewing inside him. "Good morning, sports fans," Stephen A. began with his usual energy. "We've got a packed show today, and we're starting with something that's got everyone talking, the rookie season performances that are rewriting the record books." The veteran analyst shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming silently against his leg. He knew exactly where this conversation was heading, and every muscle in his body seemed to tense up like a coiled spring. "Let's talk about the impact we're seeing in women's basketball," Stephen A. continued, glancing at his notes. Attendance numbers that nobody saw coming, merchandise flying off the shelves, and a level of excitement that's bringing new fans to the sport. This was the moment the veteran analyst had been dreading and anticipating at the same time. For weeks he had been holding back his true feelings, trying to maintain some level of professionalism, but sitting there under those bright lights with millions watching, something inside him finally snapped. "You know what, Stephen A.?" he interrupted, his voice carrying an edge that made the camera operators look up from their equipment. "I think we need to pump the brakes on all this excitement." Stephen A. raised an eyebrow but kept his composure. He had seen his colleague getting more agitated over the past few weeks, but this felt different. There was something raw and unfiltered in his voice that set off alarm bells. "Pump the brakes? What do you mean by that?" The veteran analyst leaned forward, his professional mask beginning to slip. "I mean, let's be honest about what we're really seeing here. We're talking about one player getting more attention in a few months than some Hall of Famers got in their entire careers. Does that seem right to you?" The studio suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Stephen A. could sense this wasn't going to be a normal debate about sports statistics or game strategy. This was personal, and it was about to get messy. Well, when someone comes in and immediately starts breaking records, changing the game, bringing new fans to the sport, I think that deserves attention, Stephen A. replied, trying to keep the conversation on professional ground. But his colleague wasn't having it. The frustration that had been building for months was finally finding its way out, and nothing was going to stop it now. Breaking records? The analyst's voice got louder, his hands gesturing more aggressively. "Let's talk about the real records. Let's talk about the players who've been grinding for years, putting up numbers that actually matter, not just getting headlines because they're the flavor of the month." Stephen A. felt his jaw tighten. He had been in this business long enough to recognize jealousy when he saw it, and this was jealousy in its purest form. His colleague wasn't analyzing the sport anymore. He was venting personal frustrations on live television. "Hold up," Stephen A. said, his voice taking on a warning tone. "Are you really going to sit there and diminish what we're witnessing? The sold-out arenas, the young girls wearing jerseys, the energy that's bringing new life to women's basketball?" The veteran analyst's face flushed red. Years of feeling overlooked, of watching others get recognition while he felt stuck in the background, came pouring out in a torrent of words he couldn't take back. Energy? New life? Come on, Stephen A., this is all hype. Pure media creation. You give any player this much coverage, this much promotion, and of course, they're going to look special. But take away all the cameras, all the manufactured storylines, and what do you really have? The camera crew was getting uncomfortable. This wasn't the kind of professional sports debate they were used to filming. One of the producers was frantically making hand signals from behind the cameras, trying to get the conversation back on track. Stephen A. could feel his patience evaporating. He had tried to be understanding, tried to give his colleague the benefit of the doubt. But this was crossing every line of professional journalism. Manufactured storylines? Stephen A.'s voice rose to match his colleague's intensity. Are you hearing yourself right now? We're talking about actual performance, actual impact on the sport, actual numbers that speak for themselves. But the veteran analyst was too far gone to listen to reason. The resentment that had been eating at him for weeks was now controlling the conversation. Numbers can be misleading, and you know it. Context matters. Competition level matters. But nobody wants to talk about that because it doesn't fit the narrative everyone's so desperate to push. Stephen A. stared at his colleague in disbelief. This wasn't sports analysis. This wasn't even professional disagreement. This was a man who had let his personal feelings completely cloud his judgment. What narrative are you talking about? Stephen, Harsey asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. The narrative that talent deserves recognition? The narrative that when someone comes in and immediately elevates the entire sport, we should acknowledge it? The veteran analyst laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was bitter and sharp, like glass breaking. Elevates the sport? Please, this is nothing more than media hype meeting perfect timing. Take away all the noise, all the attention, and what you've got is just another player who'll be forgotten in 2 years when the next shiny object comes along. The studio fell silent. Except for the hum of electronic equipment, even the crew members who usually moved around quietly during broadcasts had stopped what they were doing to watch this train wreck unfold. Stephen A. felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just unprofessional anymore. This was destructive. His colleague was letting personal bitterness poison what should have been an objective discussion about sports. You know what I'm hearing? Stephen A. said, his voice low but carrying clearly across the studio. I'm hearing someone who can't handle it when excellence gets the recognition it deserves. The veteran analyst's eyes flashed with anger. Excellence? You want to talk about excellence? I've been covering excellence for 15 years, real excellence. Not this manufactured, media-driven spectacle that everyone's pretending is some kind of revolutionary moment. Stephen A. shook his head slowly. He had seen enough. His colleague had crossed from professional skepticism into personal attack territory, and it was time to call it what it was. This isn't about the sport anymore, is it? Stephen A. asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. This is about you feeling left out of the conversation. This is about your ego not being able to handle that sometimes stories are bigger than our analysis of them. The words hit their target. The veteran analyst's face went from red to pale, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to respond, but couldn't find the words. The damage was done. Live on television in front of millions of viewers, their professional relationship had just exploded into pieces. And Stephen A. knew that what came next would change everything. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, the studio erupted into chaos. Crew members looked at each other with wide eyes, not quite believing what they had just witnessed. The tension that had been building for weeks had finally exploded on live television, and everyone knew they had just been part of something that would be talked about for years. Stephen A. pulled off his microphone with more force than necessary, the small device clattering onto the desk. His colleague sat frozen in his chair, staring straight ahead as if he couldn't quite process what had just happened. The reality of his outburst was starting to sink in, and the color was slowly draining from his face. We need to talk. Now. Stephen A.'s voice cut through the post-show confusion like a blade. He didn't wait for a response, just stood up and walked toward his office, expecting his colleague to follow. The veteran analyst hesitated for a moment, looking around the studio at the faces staring back at him. Some showed concern, others showed disappointment, and a few showed something that looked like pity. That last expression stung the most. Stephen A.'s office was located down a hallway lined with awards and photos from his years in sports journalism. Usually it was a place where colleagues would come to joke around, share stories, or discuss upcoming segments. Today it felt more like a courtroom. Stephen A. closed the door behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded final. He walked around to his desk but didn't sit down. Instead he stood there, arms crossed, studying the man he thought he knew. What was that? Stephen A. asked, his voice dangerously quiet. What was that display out there? The veteran analyst finally found his voice, though it came out shaky and defensive. I was giving my honest opinion. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Isn't that what journalism is supposed to be about? Stephen A. let out a short, bitter laugh. Honest opinion? That wasn't journalism. That was a personal attack disguised as sports analysis. You know it, I know it, and every person watching at home knew it. I was just trying to provide some balance, the analyst insisted, but even he could hear how weak the excuse sounded. Everyone's so caught up in the hype that nobody's looking at this objectively. Objectively? Stephen A. stepped closer, his voice rising slightly. You want to talk about objectivity? Let me ask you something. When was the last time you said something positive about her? When was the last time you acknowledged any of her achievements without immediately trying to tear them down? The question hung in the air like smoke. The veteran analyst opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He couldn't think of a single instance in recent weeks where he had given credit where credit was due. That's what I thought, Stephen A. continued. This isn't about objectivity. This isn't about balance. This is about you not being able to handle that someone else is getting the spotlight. The words hit like physical blows. The veteran analyst felt his defenses crumbling, but pride kept him fighting back. You don't understand what it's like, he said, his voice getting louder. I've been doing this for 15 years. 15 years of covering games, analyzing plays, building relationships with players and coaches, and now everyone acts like none of that matters because some rookie shows up and suddenly she's the most important thing in sports. There it was. The truth that had been hiding underneath all the professional criticism and analytical skepticism. Stephen A. had suspected it for weeks, but hearing it spoken out loud was different. It was raw and honest and deeply troubling. So this is about you, Stephen A. said, shaking his head. This whole thing, all your criticism, all your negative comments, it's because you feel overlooked. The veteran analyst's face flushed red again. It's not just about me, it's about fairness. It's about recognizing that there are other players, other stories that deserve attention too. And you think the way to fix that is by tearing down someone who's bringing new fans to the sport? You think the solution is to diminish achievements that are helping everyone in women's basketball? Stephen A. walked over to his window, looking out at the busy street below. People were going about their normal days, completely unaware of the drama playing out in this office. He wished he could trade places with any one of them right now. Let me explain something to you, Stephen A. said, turning back to face his colleague. When a player comes along who can fill arenas, sell jerseys, and get people excited about the sport, that's good for everyone. That's good for the veteran players you claim to care about. That's good for the sport as a whole. The veteran analyst slumped into a chair, the fight starting to go out of him. But what about the players who've been grinding for years? What about the ones who never got this kind of attention despite having great careers? What about them? Stephen A. asked. Are their achievements somehow less valuable because someone new is getting attention? Does her success take anything away from what they've accomplished? The question forced the veteran analyst to really think about what he was saying. He had been so focused on what felt unfair that he hadn't considered the bigger picture. He started, then stopped. I just feel like I'm becoming irrelevant. Like everything I've worked for doesn't matter anymore. And there it was, the heart of the issue. Stephen A. had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made him feel a mixture of anger and sadness. Anger at how his colleague had let personal insecurities affect his professional judgment. Sadness that someone he had worked with for years had been struggling with these feelings without talking about it. You think you're irrelevant because you're not the center of the story? Stephen A. asked, his voice softer now but still firm. That's not how this works. Our job isn't to be the story. Our job is to tell the story, to analyze it, to help people understand what they're seeing. The veteran analyst looked up, and for the first time in weeks, Stephen A. saw something other than resentment in his eyes. There was confusion, maybe even a hint of regret. I know that, he said quietly. I know that's what we're supposed to do, but sitting there every day watching everyone get excited about something and feeling like I have to be the one voice saying it's not that special, it's exhausting. Stephen A. sat down across from him. Then why do it? Why choose to be that voice? Why not find a way to appreciate what's happening while still maintaining your professional standards? Because someone has to provide balance, the analyst insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. No, Stephen A. said firmly. Someone has to provide honest analysis. Balance doesn't mean automatically taking the opposite position just to be different. It means looking at all sides of a situation and giving fair commentary. The room fell quiet except for the sound of traffic outside and the distant hum of the studio equipment down the hall. Both men sat in their chairs processing what had just been said. Stephen A. looked at his colleague, this person he had worked alongside for years, and realized how little he had really known about what was going on inside his head. The jealousy, the insecurity, the fear of becoming irrelevant, it had all been building up like pressure in a volcano. "What happens now?" the veteran analyst asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Stephen A. stood up and walked back to his desk. "Now you have to decide what kind of journalist you want to be, and you have to decide if you can separate your personal feelings from your professional responsibilities." The weight of those words settled over both of them like a heavy blanket. They both knew that what had happened in the studio couldn't be undone. The cameras had captured everything, and by now clips were probably already spreading across social media. The veteran analyst stood up slowly, looking older than he had that morning. "I think I need some time to figure that out." As he reached for the door handle, Stephen A. called out to him, "For what it's worth, I hope you do, because the person who got into this business 15 years ago, the one who loved sports and wanted to share that love with others, that person is still in there somewhere." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Stephen A. alone with his thoughts and the knowledge that everything had changed. The confrontation was over, but the real consequences were just beginning. The next morning felt different from the moment Stephen A. walked into the ESPN building. The usual energy was still there, but underneath it was something else. Whispers followed him down the hallway. People who normally made eye contact and said good morning suddenly seemed very interested in their phones or paperwork. Word travels fast in the television world, and everyone knew about yesterday's confrontation. The clip from their on-air argument was already circulating on social media, with millions of views and thousands of comments. Some people were taking sides, others were calling for both hosts to be fired, and everyone had an opinion about what had happened. Stephen A. tried to focus on preparing for the day's show, but his mind kept wandering back to that conversation in his office. His colleague had left looking defeated, and Stephen A. hadn't heard from him since. No text messages, no phone calls, nothing. The silence was almost worse than the arguing had been. The production meeting that morning was awkward. The veteran analyst showed up 5 minutes late, avoided eye contact with everyone, and barely spoke except to grunt acknowledgement when the producers outlined the day's segments. Stephen A. could see the other staff members shooting nervous glances between them. "Are we going to address yesterday's show?" one of the younger producers asked carefully. Stephen A. looked at his colleague, waiting to see if he would respond. When he didn't, Stephen A. spoke up. "We're professionals. We'll handle it professionally." But even as he said the words, Stephen A. could feel the tension building again. His colleague was sitting there like a ticking time bomb, and everyone in the room could sense it. The show started normally enough. Stephen A. delivered his opening monologue with his usual energy, covering the day's sports headlines and upcoming games. His colleague contributed when asked direct questions, but his responses were short and clipped. The chemistry that had made them a successful broadcasting team was completely gone. Then they got to the segment about rising stars in women's basketball. Stephen A. had specifically asked the producers to keep it general, focusing on multiple players and avoiding any specific focus on Caitlin Clark. He hoped that might prevent another blow-up, but he should have known better. The moment the topic came up, he could see his colleague's jaw tighten. The veteran analyst's hands gripped his notes a little too tightly, and his breathing became slightly more pronounced. Stephen A. tried to keep the conversation moving quickly, but it was like trying to defuse a bomb while the timer was counting down. "Women's basketball is experiencing incredible growth right now," Stephen A. said, keeping his tone neutral and professional. "Attendance is up across the board, and we're seeing young players making immediate impacts." His colleague nodded, stiffly but didn't respond. Stephen A. continued, hoping to get through the segment without incident. "The level of talent coming into the professional leagues is really impressive. These young women are bringing new energy and excitement to the sport." That's when his colleague finally spoke up. "Energy and excitement," he repeated, his voice carrying that familiar edge that had caused problems yesterday. "That seems to be the only thing anyone wants to talk about these days." Stephen A. felt his stomach drop. Here we go again, he thought. Well, when you have players who can immediately make an impact and bring new fans to the sport, that's worth discussing, Stephen A. replied carefully. But his colleague was already past the point of careful discussion. The frustration and resentment that had been simmering all morning was about to boil over again. Make an impact, the veteran analyst said, his voice getting louder. Let's be real about what kind of impact we're talking about here. We're talking about one player getting treated like she's single-handedly saving women's basketball. Stephen A. could see the camera operators exchanging worried glances. The producers behind the cameras were making frantic hand signals, trying to get the conversation back on track. But it was too late. And you know what the real problem is? His colleague continued, his voice rising with each word. Everyone's so caught up in the hype that they're forgetting about the players who've actually earned their respect, the ones who've been carrying this sport for years without getting a fraction of this attention. Stephen A. had heard enough. Yesterday's private conversation hadn't changed anything. His colleague was still letting personal jealousy poison his professional judgment, and now he was doing it again on live television. Hold up, Stephen A. said, his voice cutting through his colleague's rant. What are you really trying to say? Here? The veteran analyst turned to face him directly, and Stephen A. could see something dangerous in his eyes. All the hurt feelings, all the professional frustration, all the personal insecurities were right there on the surface, ready to explode. I'm trying to say that maybe, just maybe, we should hold people to the same standards instead of lowering the bar just because someone brings in ratings. That did it. Stephen A. felt something snap inside him. His colleague wasn't just criticizing a player anymore. He was questioning the integrity of everyone involved in covering the sport. Lowering the bar? Stephen A.'s voice rose to match his colleague's intensity. Are you serious right now? Are you really going to sit there and suggest that recognizing legitimate achievement is somehow lowering standards? The studio suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. This wasn't a professional disagreement anymore. This was personal, and everyone watching could feel it. Legitimate achievement? The veteran analyst laughed, but there was no humor in it. Come on, Stephen A. You know as well as I do that context matters. Competition level matters, but nobody wants to talk about that because it doesn't fit the story everyone's desperate to tell. Stephen A. stared at his colleague in disbelief. After everything they had discussed yesterday, after all the honest conversation about jealousy and insecurity, his colleague was still choosing to go down this path. You know what I think? Stephen A. said, his voice low but carrying clearly across the studio. I think you can't handle seeing someone else get the recognition they deserve. I think this has nothing to do with standards or context or any of that. The words hit their target. The veteran analyst's face flushed red and his hands started shaking slightly. He was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Don't you dare make this about me, he said, pointing a finger at Stephen A. This is about integrity. This is about not letting media hype override actual analysis. Media hype? Stephen A.'s voice exploded across the studio. You want to talk about integrity? Let me tell you about integrity. Integrity is admitting when someone is special instead of tearing them down because you feel left out of the conversation. The veteran analyst shot to his feet, his chair rolling backward. Left out? I've been covering this sport longer than most of these players have been alive. I've earned the right to call out nonsense when I see it. Stephen A. stood up too, facing his colleague across the desk. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of this professional relationship falling apart in real time. You've earned the right to be jealous? Stephen A. asked, his voice cutting like a knife. You've earned the right to let your personal feelings corrupt your professional judgment? Personal feelings? The veteran analyst was almost shouting now. This isn't personal. This is about maintaining some perspective in a world that's lost its mind over one player. That was the moment Stephen A. reached his breaking point. His colleague was still refusing to acknowledge what everyone could see, still hiding behind professional excuses for what was clearly personal resentment. You are filthy! Stephen A. erupted, his voice echoing through the studio and beyond. Absolutely filthy for letting your jealousy poison what should be a celebration of excellence in sports. The studio fell completely silent. Even the hum of electronic equipment seemed to pause. The veteran analyst stood frozen, his mouth open, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. Stephen A. continued, his voice still loud but more controlled now. That's what this is. That's what it's always been. You can't stand that someone else is getting attention, so you're trying to tear them down. And that is filthy behavior for someone who's supposed to be a professional journalist. The veteran analyst's face went from red to pale in seconds. He looked around the studio at all the faces staring at him, then back at Stephen A., then at the cameras that had captured every word. The explosion was complete. There was no coming back from this moment, no way to pretend it hadn't happened. In front of millions of viewers, their professional relationship had just been destroyed completely. And everyone knew that what came next would change everything forever.